This is episode 416 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Matthew Johnson, Professor of Anthropology at Northwestern University and the author of English Houses 1300 to 1800. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's plays, we see 6 total references to tennis. Polonius mentions an argument over a tennis game in Hamlet. Henry V and Pericles talk about tennis courts. And there's even a couple of references to tennis balls that show up in Shakespeare's other plays, talking about them being played at the game of tennis, as well as being stuffed as part of the process of making a tennis ball. We can tell that Shakespeare and his contemporaries knew about the game of tennis, but where did it come from? How was it played? Do we know anything about the tennis courts that they would have been using? To find out more about the tangible history of the game of tennis from Shakespeare's lifetime, we are talking with Laurence Grove. Laurence is a professor of French and text image studies at the University of Glasgow and was recently the guest expert for an article inside PBS's report into newly discovered images that reveal some interesting new findings about the 16th century history of tennis. Laurence joins us today to share these findings as well as to explain what tennis would have been like for Shakespeare. Did you know that you can look at the 16th century tennis images and museum objects we're talking about in the show while you listen? Join us inside That Shakespeare Society, where you'll find our research vault for today's conversation, featuring museum artifacts, primary documents, illustrated maps, and other behind-the-scenes research. Visit CassidyCash.com/episode 416 and click That Shakespeare Society to explore the extras for today's episode. And now, back to the show. Hello, Laurence. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. Good afternoon, Cassidy. It's lovely to be here.
I'm excited about this episode and exploring the idea of the history of tennis from the 16th and 17th century. And in researching it, I read an article by Lorna Baldwin at PBS, and she describes images that were found by archivists at the University of Glasgow, saying, quote, "What may be the earliest printed pictures of the game of tennis," end quote, anywhere. These images date to 1540, and that's 24 years before the birth of William Shakespeare, who was born in 1564. Laurence, what images were found and where were they?
Yeah, the images are from emblem books, which was a whole genre of printed, illustrated books. One of them is from Guillaume de la Perrière, and it's called Le Théâtre des Bons Engins, which means the theatre of fine devices. So that's for 1541. And then a slightly later one is from Barthélemy Hanot's Imagination Poétique, which is from 1552, so a little bit closer to Shakespeare. These are basically books that put together text and image. You're then meant to juggle the two around and come up with a moral which will tell you the meaning of life or something about life or just something to amuse you. These were basically 16th century memes or Instagram posts. They were popular. They were obviously limited in audience because they were printed books, but they were nonetheless not necessarily considered to be what we might nowadays call high culture. The one by La Perrière compares the back and forth of tennis to witty banter and verbal jousting. It's very much like Shakespeare, the type of back and forths we get in his plays. Hanot suggests slightly differently that the energy spent on tennis is representative of any time-consuming, enjoyable, but basically fruitless activity. So some people would say that's still sport today. I don't agree.
My son loves to play tennis, and I think he would argue the fruitless argument to the hilt, because I think he's definitely in line with the people who wrote the book in thinking that tennis is definitely a pathway towards finding the meaning of life.
Exactly. If life is fruitless, then a fruitless activity is the meaning of life. There's also another version in French in 1567 by Johannes Sambucus, which also labels it as a waste of time. But the hint is that it's an enjoyable waste of time. What better to do with your time than waste it? And the Latin expression is temporis jactura, to be thrown away. So it's in the same way that you throw away the tennis ball, you throw away time, but that's the best thing you can possibly do. These books are in Glasgow University Library, which is, Glasgow is lucky enough to be an ancient university. It dates from 1451, which does mean at times we're a bit stuffy, but it does mean we also have an incredible library. And the Emblem book collection is part of the Sterling Maxwell collection. Sterling Maxwell was a Victorian gentleman. There are problems with Victorian gentlemen, but I think he was one of the good guys. And his passions included photography, Spanish painting, and picture books. So he's quite ahead of his time. He collected something like 2,000 of these picture books, which he left to the university. So we have the world's best collection.
Well, God bless the unique hobbies of Victorian gentlemen, because how else would we be able to see this?
Well, exactly. And also he was a fan of Shakespeare, and he had a Victorian gentleman's fan club where they made facsimile editions of some of the books, and they would write about the influence of emblems on Shakespeare. So Victorian gentlemen, Shakespeare, things we love.
Laurence has been kind enough to send us some of these images, and I will put links to them inside that Shakespeare Society so you can look at the images yourself. But Laurence, I think at least one of these images from 1552, the tennis players don't actually have a net. Is this common for tennis to be played without a net? And what other realities of how they depicted tennis in these images might have changed the way we would expect tennis to have been played in the 16th century?
Yeah, there are some of the images where it's a string across the centre of the court rather than a net, and that does seem to be an element of real tennis being real as in royale, being the tennis of Shakespeare's time and just before. The images, strikes me, are fairly accurate, and I'm basing that on some of the images we see of tennis courts that have survived. The differences are, for instance, that there are walls all around the court, and the walls can be used to bounce the balls off the wall. There is a back wall with various slots, which you get points if you do get the ball through the hole in the wall and out into the wilderness. And also, perhaps most marked is there is an audience section, which looks a bit like a stand at Wimbledon, which is covered with a roof. The audience sits behind the stand, behind a net so the ball won't hit them, under the roof, and the roof is part of the game. Part of the game involves knocking the ball onto the roof from service, and you can't start playing properly until it then lands off the roof and into the court. So although the tennis we see isn't the tennis that we now get on the Grand Slam circuit, it does have lots of similarities, and it is also still the sport that is played in some places called real tennis.
There's a movie called Ever After that came out several years ago, but in it, they recreate tennis, and it looks a lot like, in the film, they make it look a lot like what you have described here, with the nets protecting the audience and it being this covered spectacle. In that film, I believe they do have a tennis net across, and it sounds like tennis. Is it real tennis or real tennis? Does the adjective come before the word or after?
It comes before. It's real, but it should be real as in the football club, Real Madrid.
Gotcha. Okay. So, but that version sounds like it's almost a combination of racquetball and what we would think of tennis today, in the sense that sometimes it was played against a wall instead of across a net.
You could say that it's the ancestor of all racket sports, in that it's got a lot of tennis in it, but a bit of squash, a bit of pickleball, a bit of badminton, and it all goes back to this real tennis.
Now, you mentioned that you were comparing the images of the tennis courts in these images to surviving tennis courts from this period. I know there was at least one in Scotland, but are there others? And do they survive today? When you say they're surviving, are these 16th century tennis courts that still exist?
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably a couple of dozen or maybe up to 30 which still exist. The most famous ones are the one you mentioned, Falkland Palace in Scotland, in Fife, which is east of Scotland, but also in Hampton Court is near London, is a very famous real tennis court. Some of these have clubs. So, for instance, in Falkland Palace in Scotland, you can join the real tennis club and you can play the game.
See, I just didn't need an additional reason to want to move to Scotland. But now you've given me yet another reason why it's got to be one of the coolest places on earth.
As long as you can deal with the rain.
In Henry IV, Part 2, Henry V makes this statement about tennis. He says, quote, "But that the tennis court keeper knows better than I, for it is a low ebb linen with thee when thou keepest not racket there," end quote. Now, this is a lot of words here, and I would like you to help us understand what's happening in this statement. I'm not sure I recognize what a low ebb linen even means, and especially in relation to tennis. I'm curious about the keeping of a racket in specific places. What have you learned in studying these new images and looking into the history of tennis from this time period that might fill in the gaps for us here about what Henry V is talking about?
Yeah, I think as with much of Shakespeare, there's always going to be some ambiguity. But I think here we're coming back to the notion in the emblem books of tennis as an enjoyable waste of time for those who can so indulge. And the idea that if you haven't got time in life to waste, then is life worth it? So when a bon viveur doesn't have the time and the means to play tennis, and that's what I think he means by low ebb linen, not having the wherewithal to procure clean clothes for whatever reason. The low ebb linen means you've run out of clothes because you can't afford to get them cleaned or to get new ones. When you've run out of clothes and you can no longer come to the tennis club, well, then it's a pretty sad state of affairs. I think that's the point he's making here.
So Henry V is of the opinion that true success can be measured in how much leisure time you actually have available to yourself.
Yeah, exactly, which is sometimes still today. There's some people...
I think there's some truth in it, yeah.
Yeah.
The mention of a tennis court keeper, it sounds a lot like a property manager. And does that indicate that the sport might have been this more expensive hobby that was than what would have been afforded to some of the lower classes? I mean, was tennis a game that was played in elite circles only? Or was there something akin to a public tennis court available where, hobbyists that weren't necessarily the King of England might be able to engage in this sport?
No, I think as far as we can tell, or at least from the surviving courts, it was associated with royal residences such as Falkland Palace. I think the keeper is similar maybe to a college porter in certain universities. So somebody who might be a servant, but in reality it's the servant who runs the show. And I suspect that as with certain Californian country clubs today, the unspoken rule was definitely no riffraff.
If you enjoy learning about the history of William Shakespeare and you want to go one step further to really experience the history for yourself, then consider joining Experience Shakespeare. This premium tier on Patreon lets you go behind the curtain and get hands-on with your history, trying out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. All of these activities are ones you can complete at home or in your classroom. And as a special bonus for joining our community of history lovers, you also get access to our exclusive library of virtual tours, animated plays, printable history guides, and special discounts on all the items in That Shakespeare Life shop. If you are ready to go beyond just learning and start experience Shakespeare's history for yourself, then join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and click on Experience Shakespeare. I'll see you inside. And now back to the show. Where were the most famous tennis courts of Shakespeare's lifetime? You mentioned Falkland being in Fife, and I think you said that there was Hampton Court Palace had one near London, but that you referenced over a dozen of them. Are there any others that we should look into specifically if we want to see what this would have been like for this time period?
There are several in southern England. There are also actually modern ones as far as Australia. To go further a little bit, I would say France as well. And in Versailles, there's a jeu de paume, which is a version of real tennis, a paume being hand. So it's a game of hand because you'd hit the ball with your hand rather than a racket. which was made famous for the serment in 1789, which played a key role in the revolution when they were about to really kick off the French Revolution. The meeting they had that set it in motion was held in a tennis court. And in the paintings we have, for instance, a famous one by Jacques-Louis David, we clearly see that everybody is within the rules, within the walls of the tennis court.
I was hoping France would make an appearance in terms of the history of tennis. I would be surprised if they didn't have. It seems like a very French sport to me.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that makes sense. And I was quickly searching, trying to see if I could find, because my memory wants to think that there is a reference in Shakespeare to jeu de paume, but I couldn't find it fast enough to say so right now. So I'll look that up later and see if I can find it for the show notes after the show. But speaking of, the French, famously in Henry V, the Dauphin offers a box of tennis balls to Henry. Now in the play, this is an effort to insult him, implying Henry is nothing but a playboy. In the story, Henry turns this insult around and makes it a rallying cry against the Dauphin and a symbol for Henry's strength in battle. Laurence, does the effectiveness of this box of tennis balls to insult the king play out in life as well as on stage? Does it tell us something about the reputation of tennis for the 16th century? Would most people have considered it a frivolity?
Absolutely, a playboy's frivolity. And I think that we're coming back here to one of the emblems again, La Perrière's emblem, where he compares tennis to verbal jousting. You hit an insult across to somebody and they hit it back, and then you hit it back again, which is almost like modern politics today. You have to be willing and ready to give and to get as good as you give. In this particular case, I think it is a bawdy put down. I think there is a reference, to be direct, to balls is a play on words with the slang use of balls, which still exists today as it did then, and which also fits in with the idea of virility. So maybe it's boys coming up with boyish humours. Again, if you look at some of the tennis illustrations from the emblem books, a key feature are very big cod pieces. So there is an idea of sexuality and manliness and virility in these knocking back the ball.
Which is certainly very appropriate to Shakespeare in terms of being on brand for what Shakespeare likes to include in his plays, and for the audiences and their expectations. That kind of humor was expected to be on the stage. But I'm really surprised at this double entendre, because if that's how it existed 400 years ago, that's a really old double entendre. I mean, I had expected we applied this meaning after the fact, but are you saying that double meaning for the word balls existed in the 16th century for Shakespeare?
Absolutely. I don't think they were any less rude then than we are today. I did go to the point just to double check of going, there's a dictionary of slang called Green's Dictionary of Slang, which is extremely helpful, and it quotes different usages across the century. And the word balls, meaning testicles, goes back as far as the early 16th century. It's certainly known in literature in the 16th century. And then there are a number of uses throughout the 17th century. I don't think anyone in Shakespeare's time would be blushing. Well, they might be blushing, but they wouldn't be surprised by that usage, and they would probably get a little bit of childish humor out of it.
Well, moving to the side of the slang version, let's talk about the actual physical tennis equipment. Would the tennis balls have been made by like a company, or who would have been putting them together, and what were they made of? I have a standing assumption that tennis balls for Shakespeare's lifetime weren't bright green. So what color would they have been, and did they bounce, and what were they stuffed with?
As far as we can tell, they were white. The ones used to play real tennis in Falkland Palace today are yellow, but I think the ones from Shakespeare's time were white. I say that because there is an example in the London Museum where one of their objects, and it's catalogued online, it is a tennis ball. So it's basically leather which is stitched up and stuffed with, in this case, with dog hair. There's nothing to indicate they were anything other than white. As to who made them, I think it had to be an artisan or at least a tradesperson. The London Museum talks of a delivery of tennis balls. It was known in France that there was the artisan trade of Paulmier, Paulmier, so a ball maker for the jeu de paume. This was generally practiced in France, and then, it seems to me, was exported. The size of the ball to go on the London example is about 4 centimetres in diameter, so it's slightly smaller than today, and they'd also be a lot heavier, which would mean they probably didn't bounce.
I think the idea of obviously France and the relations with France being a huge theme throughout the play of Henry V. For Shakespeare, I have to think he would have known about the French version of tennis and included some nods to this throughout his play, even if he didn't use the actual phrase jeu de paume in his work. So a lot to explore there in terms of Shakespeare and France and the history of tennis. From your work into this topic, if we're wanting to dive into some of that history and explore these overlapping themes and the history of the sport itself, where would you suggest that we begin to learn more?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, if you want to go back to the base source on emblems, there are a number of books about it. John Manning, The Emblem from 2002 is a very, very accessible book, which gives an overview of what these picture books were like. There's also the Sterling Maxwell Centre's webpage at the University of Glasgow, which will link you to various digitized emblems throughout the 16th century and beyond, as well as related scholarship and events. In terms of real tennis, I would say if you can get to Scotland, visit Falkland Palace, or in England as well, go to some of the tennis courts there, Hampton Court. But whilst you're waiting to do that, maybe look at the websites. Both the website of Hampton Court and Falkland Palace are extremely useful. And the Falkland Palace website includes a section on tennis, how to play tennis, the rules of the game. There is also a book which I've not managed to get hold of because it seems like quite an esoteric one by Roman Krasnarek called The First Beautiful Game, Stories of Obsession in Real Tennis. And this is from 2006. And from what I've been able to read online, it does seem like an account of those who play real tennis, what are they like, and what stories go with them. So that strikes me that could certainly be a fun read.
These are excellent resources, and we will place links to all of them in the show notes for today's episode, as well as links to Laurence's work so you can explore what he has put together related to the history of tennis. So stay tuned for their URL for where to find those. Laurence, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Cassidy. And when you asked it, I thought, does it have to be a book from Shakespeare's time? And I thought, no, I'm not going to do this, because the one I would really take with me is David Lodge's Changing Places of 1975. So it is just gone 50 years old. It was 50 years old last year, and I think it still has so much of the humour despite the changes in technology. David Lodge's Changing Places is a humorous retelling of the differences between US and English university systems via an exchange that takes place between Philip Swallow, who's from Rummidge, which is really Birmingham, and Maurice Zapp, who's at Euphoric State University, which is really Berkeley. The two of them switch campuses and switch lives. They compare, let's say, the handwritten notes in Birmingham compared with the car culture of California. And it's peppered with amusing incidents. One of these is a game that they play in the faculty in California called Humiliation. And the idea is the players, the literary parties, have to name a book which they haven't read. And a really good choice is everybody else has read this book. So everybody who has read it gets a point, and you have to get as many points as possible. Well, one of the characters is a bit of a control freak. He wants to win at everything. But the problem with this is, in order for him to win at this, he has to show a shortcoming in his own makeup. What he chooses, and he wins the game hands down, is Hamlet. He owns up to having never read Hamlet. Everybody else has read Hamlet. He gets top points, and then 3 days later, he doesn't get tenure because the word has got out that he's an ignoramus.
It's like the university version of The Holiday, except everybody falls in love with culture and literature.
Exactly. That's exactly it. Yeah.
Well, I think choosing a book that brings you humor and thoughtfulness is a wise selection for your deserted island, indeed.
It's also got a personal note because the last semester I was in San Diego, I was lucky enough to have a scholarship there. And in San Diego, they have a Globe Theatre, which is absolutely wonderful. It looks like how I imagine the original Globe must have looked like. And it also has a Shakespeare pub, which is where I watched the sport, more football, but I could have watched the tennis in San Diego under the watchful eyes of the Bard.
How fantastic.
It did amuse me in San Diego, but my very close friend is a big tennis fan, Jordan. But the moment it rains, all games are cancelled. Nobody will play tennis in the rain.
Yeah, very, very big difference between football and soccer with tennis, which goes back to their delicate and more elite roots, I think.
Exactly. That's the way of looking at it. Yeah.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I like to work on things that I enjoy and have fun with because, it's like playing tennis. If you can't have fun, then
what's the point? Yeah.
on a book called The Collapse of the Canon. So it's considering how the type of learning we had, for instance, when I was an undergrad or at school, involved a list of great authors. We'd be given a list of, let's say, 100 authors and told, if you haven't read all of these authors, then you don't know anything about French literature or English literature. And the authors would, of course, include Shakespeare. But I think in learning today, this has been replaced. Is it possible to get an English degree in a top university without reading any Shakespeare? So that's what I'm looking at. If it has been replaced, what's it been replaced by? Why has it been replaced? And is it just a fad or will it continue long term?
Oh, that feels sad to me. I hope that your research reveals that it is not impossible that it is impossible to get an English degree at university without reading Shakespeare. Surely they must explore some. I will make signs and I will march with signs.
I can't think of anywhere where you can get a degree without having read Shakespeare, but it's a bit like the David Lodge game, maybe.
Yeah, I think it probably is. You could probably get by without it, but yeah. Well, fun things to come from Laurence Grove. Thank you so much, Laurence, for being here this week and helping us explore the history of tennis for Shakespeare's lifetime and understanding what the rackets and the balls and the game itself was all like from the 16th century. This has been a fun conversation, and I appreciate you taking time to share it with us.
Thank you, Cassidy. It's been fun, which is what it should be.
If you'd like links to our guest publications, recommended resources, and related episodes, you'll find those on the public episode page for today's show at CassidyCash.com/episode 416. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP416. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.